going to transition to our next panel, which is on enabling the enabling role of public institutions for CA development. So those panelists are going to slowly trickle in here, and while they are, let me set up this panel a little bit. We've talked so far to farmers, we've talked to private companies, now we're going to talk to public institutions. We know that the role of the public sector institutions in agricultural development involves the creation of an enabling environment for effective and inclusive participation for farmers. We've talked about that in both of the panels so far. We also heard what the expectations are from farmers and from companies in terms of what regulatory framework they need to be encouraging CA. And of course, when we're talking about the intersection of the private sector and the public sector, that is often more easily said than done. So how can public institutions create an enabling environment to make this happen? So we have our panelists, I think, slowly coming in now. If everyone on this panel can turn on your cameras, then we should be good to go. So we have two. So if, yep, now three, okay. And we are just still missing Tassos. Do we have Tassos here? Maybe while we're waiting for Tassos, let me introduce all our panelists. So we have Martin Bwalya from the New Partnership for Africa's Development, the African Union. We have Hongwen, conservation from the Conservation Tillage Research Center in China. We have Herman Rosa, a former environment minister for El Salvador. And we, hopefully in a moment, will have Tassos Haniotis from the European Commission's Agriculture Department. So right now I'm only seeing two of you, but let's start with Martin Bwalya. So my question for you, Martin, would be, how can supranational institutions like the African Union play a role in facilitating CA?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to good morning, good evening to everybody. It's a perfect question, and of course, I think important gravitation in terms of the discussions since morning. As now we look at, I would say, the morning discussions up until now, looking at a lot more from a very technological aspects. And when we look at institutions, I would like to cover this more from the systems, from the institutions, from the enabling environment, as you actually put it up. So my first point is that let me start by taking a step back, just a step back and say, when we say role of public institutions in development of CA, what actually do we mean? And what does this constitute? And I'm saying here, as we see the title of this session, in the role of public institutions in development of CA, that we need to be clear, we need to be concrete about what we mean there, for us to give us, again, a clear, concrete perspective in terms of what role can then the institutions play. And here I also want to make the point that when we talk about conservation agriculture, and this is something that we need to actually emphasize, I didn't hear it enough in the morning sessions, that when we talk about conservation agriculture, is actually a transformation of the way we farm. It's much more than picking up a new technology in terms of fertilizer, for instance, mechanization, and other technological innovations. This goes well beyond that. It's about systems change. It's about perspective. It's about mindset in the way we actually have farmed for over 100 years. And therefore, when we say the role of public institutions, I want to be very clear then that we're talking about that evolution of the way we farm and what role can then public institutions, and I'll come to super continental institutions like African Union, what role they can play. But in that context, I want to say what we then want to see in terms of what is happening in the development of conservation agriculture, and recognizing that this is a transformation of the way we farm. So we're talking about change in heritage, change in values, and how we perceive and actually look at agriculture all the way to the mindset. We're looking at then the incentives that can make that happen in terms of policy and investment choices that within context, within specific situations, can actually make the things to happen the way they should. And this is why I come to say that when we look at institutions, and this point I'm making, that we should also recognize that it's more than just the formal public institutions, what we're looking at here. I would also want to say this is just as much about the value systems, about the networks and the relationships that actually govern the way we live ultimately as a people. And therefore, specifically in terms of how do and what role do these institutions play? The first point related to the value system is that we're talking about changing mindset. We're talking about changing values, which are actually evolving over time. And therefore, there has to be from the institutions and whatever form they may be, actually an intentional system that is picking up on the messages, on the information, on the values, on the knowledge of what is actually going on, and actually build that up. And I'm talking about communication, advocacy work that is recognizing the change and putting a spotlight on those changes and contributing ultimately to the change in mindset, in the values that should move from very heavy tillage, for instance, to zero tillage, as it has been said. I'm also saying that institutions, in terms of policy and investment choices, then has to recognize what incentives. Actually, in the morning, there was a mention of the farmers being at the forefront. And this is true. The transformation we're talking about has to be people-centered. When you talk about incentives, there has to be rationalization in terms of what are the trade-offs, what are the consequences in terms of adverse implications and impacts. And those are the things that can slow down the whole transformation into conservation agriculture. And therefore, public policy, public investments has to be very deliberate. This is another turning point, because what we're talking about is not what is being pulled by a technology, is what the farmers are experiencing and want to see happening. They are themselves struggling to see how do they respond to drought, to floods, to diseases. And therefore, there is something already happening. Science investment is about helping us to recognize and understand these things and bring them to critical mass in terms of solutions. As well as looking at how these things can reach a critical mass. And that is why in Africa, and I'm concluding here, in Africa, when you look at development solutions, Africa has got a unique feature that connects between subnational, national, regional, and continental efforts. And that's why you find in Africa we have continental development frameworks. And in 2014, actually, a continental decision that put up a vision to reach 20 in conservation agriculture by 2025. So you have that. And what does that constitute? It's about pushing and pulling towards a critical mass of application. It's about economics of scale. It's about building social capital that enables also and mitigates some of the trade-offs, some of the insurance and the mitigation that is required. So the continental framework has actually enabled and allowed us to build that system. That system that should enable us to actually deliver a critical mass of momentum And these are institutional issues. And here I want to conclude by saying, even in Africa, we are clear on how this continental effort has to connect in terms of systems approach to regional efforts, to national effort, and into the front line of the subnational level, where actually the situation or the action has to happen with those farmers, with those frontline players as part of the equation in driving that evolution. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Let's now turn to Lee Hongwen from the Conservation Tillage Research Center. So how can public research bodies play a role in facilitating CA?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, where's my slide?
I'm not sure. I think we may not have slides for you.
Yeah, I have sent my slide to.
Yeah, the production is telling me they don't have any slides for you.
Okay, so.
Could you give your presentation without the slides?
Okay, yeah. So I'll just speak without slides. Thank you, Chairman. I'm Li Hongwen from China. I will talk about the adoption of conservation agriculture in China. We started conservation agriculture, maybe in China we call it conservation tillage from 1991. We established the Conservation Tillage Research Center in 1999. In 2013, Conservation Agriculture Alliance for Asia and the Pacific established and locating my team. In fact, in China, we have tried no-till since 1950s. Since 1991, more attentions were put on equipment, especially no-till seeders, which should be suitable for Chinese farmers' economic condition and small lands. I will talk then. Now I will talk about how we have done research on conservation agriculture. We found that only when we have real suitable no-till seeders, conservation agriculture can be widely used. For no-till breeders research, we also found that stubble blockage is the most important problem for no-till seeders. So many years ago, we developed handhold seed, which is very simple and no stubble blockage problem. I'm happy that it has been accepted by many countries. We also found that if we use tine opener, it will be easier to penetrate the soil, but it is also easier to be seriously blocked by stubble. So we chop it stubble after harvesting or before planting. The short stubble is easy to pass between two tine openers. In order to give more space for stubble pass, we can lift the bar higher and mount openers on 2 or 3 or more bars to make wide spaces for stubble to pass through. Even so, we still found some stubble blockage. So some additional components are designed which can move aside the stubble from openers. With those designs, no-till seeders were developed for maize and wheat in the areas of 1 crop per year. If I can show the slide, I can show some videos. we know that disc culture can open narrow furrow with little soil disturbance without stubble blockage problem in China. We also developed different types of no-till seeders with disc culture. Those no-till seeders have been also widely used in the areas of one crop a year. Some no-till seeders have been sold out of China. But in double crops areas in China, for example, in those areas, we grow maize after wheat. After wheat, we grow maize, 2 crops 1 year. With too much fresh stubble, even we use disc culture, it cannot cut through all fresh stubble and some seeds will be exposed. If we use tine openers, it will be blocked seriously. So in China, we develop strip no-till beds. With this design, the seeders can be sold in tilled strips with little stubble cover. No-till strip is covered. With those ideas, different powered components were designed to chop and throw stubble aside or behind of openers. Stubble blockage is no more problem. Within my slides, I would like to show the pictures, which we can find that such no-till or minimum till seeders can leave much stubble on surface after planting. We also developed conservation tillage models for different regions and cropping systems. We tell farmers how to do conservation agriculture and how to select suitable equipment. The benefits of conservation agriculture in China are similar as that in most countries. We found that with conservation agriculture, we can reduce wind erosion 30 to 75%. Runoff and soil loss can be also reduced by 50 to 80%. After about 3 years with conservation agriculture, earthworms no earthworm can be found in conventional tillage field. Compared with conventional tillage, conservation tillage can also reduce greenhouse gas emission. We have noticed that in last session, some presentations have mentioned about this. More water can be saved in conservation tillage field because of reduced runoff and evaporation. With above soil and water benefits in the same place with same seeds and the same fertilizer, we can get higher yields. Because of without plowing, harrowing, and leveling, conservation tillage can reduce planting cost about 50%. If cost can be reduced and the yields can be increased, farmers can get higher net income. We also publish popular science book of conservation tillage, which can be downloaded from FAO website. Conservation tillage has been in China. Conservation tillage has been included in the most important document we called #1 document Ministry of Agriculture made several plans, long-term plans, to extend the conservation tillage. In China, farmers can get subsidy from government if they buy conservation tillage equipment. With above efforts by researchers and government, conservation agriculture in China has been increased 80 times in the past 18 years. Before, at the end, I would like to give some suggestions about conservation agriculture based on my experience. Firstly, we should understand what is the baseline of conservation agriculture. Then find the best way of conservation agriculture for our own condition. We should not follow the same way from other countries. We should find our own ways based on the bottom line of conservation agriculture. Secondly, we should have our own suitable no-till seeders, not just focus on the best no-till seeders. The suitable, the best. Then we should tell farmers what is conservation agriculture, lead them to try conservation agriculture, help them to calculate the benefits, support them to continue conservation agriculture for at least 3 to 5 years to make them used to conservation agriculture. Then some of them will keep on conservation agriculture. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry, I don't know why I have no slides for my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think it was a fine presentation without the slides. Let's move on now next to Mr. Herman Rosa. So Herman, how can national governments play a role in facilitating CA?
Thank you. Governments can indeed play a significant role in facilitating CA, but that requires political will at the top to unlock the required policies and resources. Unfortunately, political will is often scarce, where CA and similar practices are needed the most, such as in my own region, the Central American Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In this region, extensive land degradation and high exposure to extreme events, such as Atlantic and Pacific cyclones, as well as droughts in the Central American dry corridor, have created a situation of high climate risk. Therefore, in this region, the relevant question is how governments can be encouraged to seriously facilitate CA and other practices to reverse land degradation so as to reduce our severe vulnerability to climate change. This is no small challenge. Politically, presidents are wary to allocate significant resources to achieve positive results that will happen mostly when they are out of office. A related consequence is that weak and underfunded extension services are not up to the task of supporting hundreds of thousands of small farmers. In that context, externally supported projects have been the main channel for sustainable agriculture initiatives, but their small scope has seriously limited their impact. Most of these projects also exclude the poorest small farmers on the most degraded land because they require significantly more support, and it is impossible to achieve meaningful results within the short project timeframes. Given that challenging context, it is vital to unlock the potential of interested and committed non-governmental actors that so far have had little impact by funding their actions and networking among themselves and with relevant government agencies, such as agriculture, research, education, and extension entities, as well as technical units in ministries of agriculture and the environment. Funding is vital to unlock the potential of this organizational ecosystem and needs to be sustained and independent of the political vagaries of national government. One way to achieve this is through fit-for-purpose funds that, in the case of the Northern Triangle, and probably other regions, should comply with the following criteria. First, a clear mandate to advance climate resilience with a special focus on transforming smallholder agriculture. Second, a robust government arrangement that includes government participation but avoids government control. Third, full operational compliance with strong fiduciary standards and strict adherence to social and environmental safeguards. And fourth, capacity to mobilize large enough resources to trigger transformation at scale. To kickstart these funds, two important steps can be taken. First, the mobilization of seed funding from international philanthropic foundations and or bilateral donors to support fund design, capacity building, and pilot operations. Here it is important to ensure that from the very beginning, appropriate governance arrangements, operational compliance with fiduciary standards, as well as social environmental safeguards are put in place. This can prepare the funds to gain access to larger sources of finance and meet in due time the qualifying criteria of the Green Climate Fund for national direct access entities. Second, the mobilization of sustained flow of funding through public debt swaps, as debt service payments go into the funds rather than to the creditors. This mechanism could be particularly important now, since the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic have resulted in skyrocketing public debt and unsustainable public deficits in our region. This public debt must be dealt with, and the negotiation of debt reductions and swaps provide an opportunity to engage debtor country governments into agreeing to verifiable climate resilient goals in their sectoral policies and allocations of resources in public budgets. For this to happen effectively, however, a close coordination may be required among international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank in particular, as well as with trade countries. The application of strong cross-conditionality may also be necessary to ensure that debtor countries' governments adhere to their commitments. In summary, for governments in high climate risk regions like the Central American Northern Triangles to play an important role in advancing the widespread adoption of CA and other related practices, some of their agencies could be integrated into an organizational ecosystem where non-state actors lead initially the effort, supported by finance that is permanent, sustained, and significant, and a climate resilient fund with the features outlined would be a way to achieve this. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Herman. Let's turn next to Tassos from the European Commission. So Tassos, what has been and what could be the EU's role in facilitating CA?
Thank you very much, Dave, for the question, and thanks everybody for being here. I think the first thing we have to clarify is that in the European Union, as in every part of the world, we need to find solutions that best serve our concrete environment, including the policy environment we're living in. And of course, the European Union is not unique in types of challenges we face in agriculture. As other parts of the world, over the years, we have improved significantly the economic and the social performance of agriculture at the cost of the environment. So the whole focus of our orientation right now is try to rebalance this by making more sustainable the manner by which we produce foods and we distribute food, and having this sustainability be at the core of a very ambitious strategy in terms of climate action. I think what is extremely important to keep in mind here is that to us is the case today, it will be the case tomorrow that various systems will coexist. We have this annual conference on the agricultural outlook situation for the next years that we organize. It was now 3.5 years ago that the first best practice example we gave was one exactly on conservation agriculture. The year after, we went into precision farming, conventional farming application, and last year we had something on organic. What is important is this coexistence of different practices should not happen at the expense of more sustainability, but it should happen with an increase in the level of ambition of all of these practices. And this is why what we try to do with our policy orientation is to address, if you want, the paradox that we have. We do have a directive on biodiversity, on air, and on water, but we don't have one on soil. But we have a policy, and a very expensive policy, it's almost 60 billion euros of subsidies annually, whose leverage is exactly on soil management, because it's a land and area-based type of payment. So what we're trying to do with our policy orientation is make sure that the level of conditionality, that is the requirements that farmers have to respect to receive these payments, is increased for all practices. And by doing that, what we also manage to do is reduce the cost difference between the most intensive and the less intensive methods of production. And that indirectly is a very strong support for conservation agriculture. Much more directly, the support comes from a series of agro-environmental measures or eco schemes and policy measures which make the reception of subsidies of farmers conditional in improving their practices. And a very significant element in this effort, of course, is what is happening in the soil and how we measure it. So we introduced a series of indicators, both at the sectoral level and at the farm level. We want to introduce that in a network of 80,000 farms we have, that we can measure in real terms what is happening in the ground with different practices, so that we are able to actually generate more knowledge about what works. And what is important here is to clarify and identify the significant gaps that exist in terms of the available knowledge between farmers. It was mentioned before, I think by Mr. Rosa, on the importance of the extension services and advice that has to be provided to farmers, so that they, farmers are pretty open to new ideas, and they say, you tell us that we need to do things better. How do we do that? So the network of transfer of knowledge is extremely important. And it's clear that all governments, be it rich or less rich, have actually underestimated over the last decades the importance of passing this information to farmers. Passing, if you want, the existing knowledge that comes from innovation on the ground. So the second area that we focus here in terms of knowledge is through what we call the European Innovation Partnership, exchange the information of innovation to all actors. And there are thousands of operational groups that actually exchange among themselves this practice, although this can clearly be much improved, not only in the transfer of knowledge in similar conditions within the European Union, but in the transfer of knowledge worldwide, because there are certain challenges that are unique, but there are certain challenges that are common to all parts of the world. And there is a responsibility of those nations that have been more lucky in terms of their economic situation to transfer this knowledge to the rest of the world. And third, and a very important area, is the focus on new knowledge. There's going to be a very important orientation in the research programs of the European Union to focus on what is called the soil mission, with the idea of looking at all type of advances that we can have with new research that will demonstrate what we can do in terms of improving the soil carbon sequestration, in terms of reducing problems of soil erosion that we have, and in terms of adapting practices to the local conditions. There are two other points that I would like to briefly mention here. Is the role of technology and the role of science is extremely important. And what is extremely important is also to see that there is a resistance sometimes, or a fear about the applications of science or of technology. Science and technology are by themselves neutral. The manner by which we apply them is less neutral. And maybe in the current context and the discussion, the debate we're having about the recovery from the COVID crisis, where we still have this debate about acceptance of science or not, that will give the opportunity to strengthen the reliance on a scientific approach in terms of addressing issues that are whose results are measurable on the ground. And that's why conservation agriculture has a very important role to play, because it is a living lab, if you want, of what best practices could do in terms of mitigating some of the problems that have been created over the past decades. And the final point is, all this is nice to talk about, but they required another side of the as well to react, which is, I mean, producers are ready to produce in a more environmentally friendly ways. Consumers have also to change their behavior patterns to be able to actually link better with these new trends, more environmentally friendly trends at the producer level. And this is where the issue of costs becomes very important. That's why I stressed in the beginning the need to increase the overall level of ambition in our environmental requirements, so that all these costs that are externalized will have to be a way of being internalized in the production process. And that would allow the most environmentally friendly methods of production not only to receive more subsidies where subsidies are available, but to receive more indirect support, because their cost gap would become smaller. So in a nutshell, that's in broad terms what we're trying to do and achieve, but I'm pretty sure that in the debate I will be glad to answer any questions that might have raised. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tassos. So I want to ask you guys first about funding, because certainly when we talk about regulatory frameworks and government action, funding, public funding, can be one of the most important determinants of what types of practices, what types of technologies get picked up. So let me ask you first, Martin, when we're thinking about public funding from various governments or other public sources, should public funding be made available for conversion to CA? And if so, how?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think several I mentioned, and several of my colleagues have mentioned the issue of incentives. And that incentives come on the back of the fact that there is a lot in conservation agriculture that relates to the public good. And in Africa, when you're looking at conservation agriculture and you put that into the complete agricultural system and food systems, you are actually talking about the environmentally friendly use of the natural resource. And the public good element there is massive. You're talking about job creation. You're talking about systems that actually contribute ultimately to better livelihoods and economic growth. So from a government point of view, in terms of the government fiscus, there's every reason to actually justify financing into conservation agriculture because of those public good aspects. Now, exactly what do you put your resources on? And that's where I think the issues would matter in terms of rubber hitting the tarmac, because we've seen some of the subsidies, for instance, that would go into and in the name of conservation agriculture. But because of where they are placed, then the impact on actual scaling up of practicing of conservation agriculture doesn't happen. I mentioned that there is at the front line is where the farmers are actually innovating to respond and adapt to the consequences of not practicing climate smart agriculture. They have to undergo a lot of adverse consequences in terms of loss, in terms of trade-offs, and even actually completely being thrown out of agriculture by floods, by drought, etc., etc. So at that level, there has to be some mechanisms that is supporting farmers to actually adapt. And I'm talking about long-term financing to adapt to change into new practices, access to, there's been talk about mechanization, access to seed that is appropriate, access to mechanization. And those are things that would help to actually consolidate that movement, that transformation into conservation agriculture. So in short, one, there is every reason in the context of public good that it is justified for government to put resources on the promotion of and development of climate of conservation agriculture. And number two is that where you place that, and it's going to vary from country to country, circumstance to circumstance, has to be properly identified, nuanced, and ensure that in terms of accountability, that the resource is going to impact where it matters most. Over.
Thanks a lot. Let's get the Chinese perspective on this, Li Hongwen, especially when we're talking about public funding for research in this area. Should public funding be going for research, and where should it be channeled?
Thank you for the question. In China, as I just mentioned during my presentation, in China, China government established a special organization on conservation agriculture. We call it Conservation Tillage Research Center. And our university also established Institute of Conservation Tillage. China Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Science and Technology have given different kind of supports for machine development and technologies like conservation agriculture models, different programs. Except those research projects, our government also, since 2002, also made three plans, 5 years after another 5 years after another 5 years, to give support for farmers to try conservation agriculture and buy no-till seeders, something like that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let's go to Herman next. Herman, what's your thoughts about whether public funding should go for CA and where should it go? You want to unmute yourself, Herman?
Yes. I think you have two situations. In the case of large commercial farmers, public funding does not seem to be the key issue. Has more to do with market signals, regulations, and policies, enabling policies. But in the case of subsistence farmers working on highly degraded lands, the mobilization of significant public funding is a must. These farmers will not adopt these type of practices without significant support and subsidies. In our case of the Northern Triangle, many of these farmers face a situation of family labor scarcity and very costly external labor due to massive migration to the United States. And the adoption of this practice requires significant labor requirements initially. Obviously, you also need substantial support from extension services. So you need funding to upgrade and scale up those services. Also, as I argued in my remarks, you need really to see beyond government and set up a whole organizational ecosystem of state and non-state actors. And that ecosystem can only function effectively if you have significant funding. So funding is essential. The issue is how do you mobilize it? And I think setting up fit-for-purpose funds can be probably a more efficient way to go because you make it independent of the political vagaries of government. And because what you need is a permanent source of sustained significant funding, because this is a process that you need to sustain over a fairly long period. It's difficult to see any significant results in less than a decade. So you need to have a scheme that is independent of changes of government and priorities and so on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So Tassos, you mentioned the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU, which is a mammoth part of the budget. And there have been efforts to green it, particularly with ring fencing, which you mentioned. When it comes to funding, EU funding, should EU funding be going towards CA, and how should it be channeled? Should it be channeled through CAP or Horizon 20, the new Horizon, or something else?
Thanks for the question. Let me clarify one thing, because the mammoth budget of the CAP, I'm not saying that the budget of the CAP is not big, but it has to do with the fact that only a very, very small part of public expenditure in the EU is going through the community budget. If you look at the overall public funding, the cap is around 1% of GDP. This is still not an insignificant amount, but I think it's good to keep that in context, especially when we talk to international audiences that have the feeling that the only money that goes in Europe of public expenditure is in agriculture. But exactly because what was said by Herman before is correct. He mentioned the permanent source. I wouldn't say that it's permanent. You never know what is permanent, but it's a fixed source that farmers know they're going to get. It is extremely important, the conditions under which they get this funding. And what we have tried over the years to do, don't forget the Commission makes proposals, but it's the Council of Ministers and the Parliament that takes the decisions. And that's why some of the steps we have taken is less ambitious than initially thought, but they all go in the same direction. The first is a redistribution of support towards smaller and mid-sized farmers. The big farms in the European Union are not everywhere. They're part of a previous system in certain parts of Europe, but it's there. And we have done systematic efforts to redistribute support towards smaller farmers. So there is a social dimension in the policy that is being strengthened over the years. The second thing we have done is we have imposed for every farmer a minimum level of commitments that have to be respected, for which they don't receive money in recognition of doing what should be the inevitable, but they face penalties if they don't do it. This conditionality, cross-compliance in our previous jargon, is the one that has a lot to do with soil management, including what is also a characteristic of Europe, the very important role of extensive pasture land in livestock systems, especially for climate action. Extensive pasture land is very important, though. So these grasslands are very important as carbon sinks. So increasingly, we wanted, and we still want, in the discussions we're having, and we hope to finalize next week, to increase the level of ambition of these conditionality requirements. But much more importantly is targeting specifically to best agro-environmental practices funding. We have done it through agro-environmental programs, but we saw that covered only 20% of the area. And now what we're trying to do with the eco schemes is increase the area coverage of this type of schemes. And in this, conservation agriculture and organic farming play an extremely important role. There's an extremely ambitious target for organic farming to move higher the area from 8% that is today to 25% by 2030. But that, of course, doesn't mean that methods of production that are not exactly organic but are pretty close to it, like conservation agriculture, are not going to be supported. On the contrary, there's going to be a lot of money going to it. It is important also to channel money through research funds, but we shouldn't forget that the benefit of new research will take quite some time to come, while already there is knowledge about what best practices do on the ground, and it's exactly this knowledge that we want to transfer and accelerate their applications.
Thanks a lot. Well, we have some questions that have come in from the audience, so let me take those now. So first we have a question from Nixon Wafula. So Nixon asks, most governments and institutions have developed and adopted very good policies surrounding climate change mitigation. The problem has been the implementation or the lack of political goodwill to affect the policies. What can we do in the area of enforcement, especially in this aspect? Tassos, maybe I'll put this to you first, actually, because this is a notable problem that people talk about in the EU, that oftentimes implementation can lag after something is adopted at EU level. What can we do to improve implementation, particularly when it comes to climate-friendly agricultural measures?
Thanks for the question. Let me use a phrase that I used the other week at the organic conference. I think the first thing we have to do is move away from a logic of self-congratulation or self-flagellation. I mean, things are not black or white. We have to show progress where it takes place, because in this way we learn from what has worked, but at the same time we should not hide what is lagging behind. The experience that we have had in the European Union over the years of CAP reform and the more than 30 years of reform is that this process is never linear. You are by nature more ambitious where you make proposals because you have a vision of where you want things to go, but in the political realities, we have compromises. And especially when you have to deal with 27 member states and with the European environment involved, it's natural and inevitable to have compromises. For me, the most important element is to make sure that you start a process of reform where the path is irreversible. So it's not the initial speed that counts that much, but the direction of change. Because if the direction of change is in the right orientation, farmers are not going to listen and learn from what politicians or we bureaucrats tell them. They will see from each other what works. And part of the advantages that I see with methods that are more benign in terms of the environment, like conservation agriculture, is if your neighbor sees that some of the myths about certain practices do not apply, but these practices are really better for the environment, and especially in the longer term, they're going to move in this particular direction, especially when the conditionality and the control aspects are applied. But the most important thing here is the change in mentality and the transparency and the communication of what is really happening. Because if we have systems where we know what is the outcome of practices, best or not that good practices, and with the modern world, you only have to look at satellite imagery, which, at least from the Copernicus system of the European Union, is available for free to see what is happening, then the public pressure on what goes wrong and the pressure to improve things becomes also an important component. But it's a really multifaceted element that doesn't have simple answers. But the important thing is also to be aware of the fact that in the real world, we're not going to have linear progress all the time. And we have to be vigilant that the path of reform doesn't lose momentum.
Martin, do you encounter these problems as well in Africa when you have, kind of grand plans, as Tassos put it, when you're setting ambition levels, but then when it's time for implementations, it's actually harder to get things done?
Yes, thank you. It is actually one of the major issues that comes up all the time in terms of development progress. And everyone would say implementation is the problem. And that is very true. You would see a lot of signals of that kind. But on the other side, and as Haniotis is saying, one, within the continent, and I'm also referring to the decision of the African Union in 2014 to scale up climate smart agriculture and conservation agriculture to 25 million households by 2025. You would see that there's actually a lot of spots of success. And I use the word sports deliberately because the issue then is how do we get to critical mass? How do we scale out and up from these successful sports? So on that side, you'd say something is happening. The problem is they're not going to scale. But we also know on the other side that when you look at policies and the poor performance in implementation of policies, you also would recognize that there would be some very, very bad policies excellently executed. So there is something that is amiss there. And in terms of moving forward, and in fact, as the African Union Development Agency, one of the things we are doing now is what Haniotis has just been saying, is that in that implementation equation, insofar as some of the implicated constituencies are not participating, you are likely not to see implementation. Participating in terms of power relationships, in terms of accountability, and we are saying that in Africa to actually galvanize critical mass of implementation, we need to also bring in and focus on empowering communities, citizenry responsibilities, citizenry action. And this is recognizing that the populations, on one side, they are the ones that actually have to implement to a very large extent, but they are also responsible to call the checks and balances and ask the questions. And that in itself is an important part. And it doesn't mean that the others are not willing to do it, but it's just the natural system of those power relationships that the populations are being empowered to call the checks and balances, ask the questions, and that would galvanize actually a lot of implementation. It's the reason I said in my presentation that what you are looking at when you talk about scaling up conservation agriculture is a lot of engagement at community level. In Africa, we have structures such as the traditional leadership, the subnational community-based organizations and community leadership that actually have been largely marginalized when it comes to development efforts. And those can be very critical in actually advancing change and the change that we need. Over.
Thanks a lot. Let me move on to another question from the audience here. So we have a question from an anonymous questioner. How can a reliable system be set up by public institutions to convince the farmers in rural environments to give himself over to the practice of conservation crops without changing his values and his knowledge inherited from his ancestors? So I think that's really going to this question of agriculture. In a lot of people's minds, when they think of farms and farming, they think of this age-old practice, and sometimes there can be resistance to new technologies because people associate agriculture with something old or something ancient. Let's go to Li Hongwen for this, because you're really dealing with advances in agriculture and research here. How can people be convinced that new farming techniques are not a betrayal of an ancient farming way of life?
Thank you. I guess these questions must be from a conventional agriculture practice or some exchange. I guess he might met the problem of how to extend conventional agriculture. According to my experience in China, to do conventional agriculture research and extend this technology, I found that conservation agriculture, firstly, conservation agriculture is agriculture technology, not environmental technology. I think this technology firstly should give high yield or high benefit for farmers. So at the beginning, everywhere in China, we do demonstration with supports from government to do demonstration to show farmers what is conventional agriculture. We ask them to see how we did it at planting time and invite them to see at harvesting time. Ask them to compare plant growing condition and ask them to compare the use between conventional agriculture and conventional tillage. We also ask them to compare the benefits, economic benefits. Even so, we found that at the beginning, 3 even to 5 years, many farmers in China, many farmers still not accept this technology. So our government give some subsidies to farmers. If farmers buy no-till seeders, they can get some subsidy. And with no-till seeders, some farmers will want to try conventional conservation agriculture. We found that if some farmers can try the conservation agriculture for 3 to 5 years or a little more, even 6 years, some of them will continue conservation agriculture by themselves without government support. So my conclusion for this question is that tell farmers what is conservation agriculture, lead them to try, make them to keep on it for at least 3 to 5 years. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Herman, what's your thoughts on this? How can we convince people to not see these types of innovations as against the history of agriculture? You want to unmute yourself, Herman?
I don't think it's much a matter of convincing people. People are aware that these practices can help them, that can have positive results. The problem is the time lag. Particularly when you have highly degraded landscapes, it takes quite a while to get the positive results. So unless you compensate people, unless you incentivize people, they will not adopt these practices. So it's not so much about knowledge generation or awareness building, at least in our region, because we have a long history, a long experience, thousands, hundreds of projects that have shown that this works. But for people to make the leap, they need incentives, they need support, they need some form of compensation. And this is entirely justified because the off-farm benefits are significant in terms of water security, in terms of disaster risk reduction, and so on. So, but I think the real problem is that when we have this time lag, politicians are not very inclined to take this seriously because they're not interested in the results that will happen when they're out of office. And people, unless they are certain they will have sustained support, they will not make the leap either. So I don't think there's so much an issue of convincing people, but making sure that you have sustained support and enough resources to make this happen.
Well, we have a next question from the audience for Tassos. This question comes from Turi Felecia. The EU has set a target to move from 8% to 25% with regard to organic farming. What is the envisaged time frame for this target? And what about CA? Could CA have a target? And if so, what kind of timeline?
Well, the timeline for this target is 2030. And it's it's a non-legally binding target. It's a target that applies at the EU as a whole, and we will look at the strategic plans of member states, which have very different starting points. We have member states at 2 to 3% of area and organic, others that are already at 25%, and see how everybody is moving. But the question is very pertinent because we don't want to prioritize or monopolize one practice over the other. What is extremely important is to shift our policy orientation from one that is based on compliance to one that is more and more based on performance. And there is a whole range of incentives that we take a whole workshop to actually explain most of them. But what is important, keep in mind, all of these incentives focus on the same thing. Wherever we are today, whatever situation we face, the overall level of ambition has to go up, which means measurably when it comes to soil, when it comes to the use of pesticides, to the use of fertilizers, the use of antibiotics in animal production, there has to be a very clear improvement. And practices that move in this direction are going to be recognized and actually supported more with the series of measures, both in terms of agro-environmental measures in what we call second pillar, the rural development aspects of our policy, but also in terms of direct payments with these new eco schemes. We don't know what percentage they will take, but a very significant percentage. It's through the eco schemes that practices like conservation agriculture are going to be supported much more in the future.
Thanks a lot. So we have a next question here. So this question is for Martin, and it comes from El Hassan Borarak. So currently, what are the levers for the African Union to promote CA at the sub-regional and at the country level? We've heard a bit about the EU's levers, notably the CAP. What can the African Union do?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the African Union as a continental body has got a number of levers and drivers and actually actual work that is underway in promoting, supporting the transition on conservation agriculture. One is that in agriculture, there has been a continental decision that is being used to governize both policy incentives as well as investment incentives to actually scale up conservation agriculture, like I said, to 25 million households by 2025. What does that mean? This means that in terms of practice, actually the African Union is working with regional institutions, and this has been domesticated at regional level and national level in terms of how and what the countries need to do in driving that level of practicing or scaling up in practicing of conservation agriculture. I want to underline here, and it also relates to the questions that were asked earlier, that in these efforts, one of the primary issue is actually about providing incentives to the practitioners on the ground. And for them, actually, as long as innovations, various technological promotions do not clearly put money in the pocket of these farmers, of these frontline players, then you are going to push until the sun sets. So the clarity and the concreteness of how this will translate into better livelihoods, into improved life for the farmers is actually important. And in fact, when we are doing domestication at national level especially, Minister of Finance is going to ask, why should I put more money on conservation agriculture? And the justification comes from the impact of conservation agriculture on the livelihoods of the people in terms of access to food, access to money in the pocket, and of course, all other benefits, socioeconomic benefits and environmental benefits that goes with it. So the systems are there, and what we're doing, as I mentioned, the continental level target is being domesticated. That is in agriculture, it's the same thing in the environment. And the message here is actually that you don't work outside existing establishments, whether institution, whether policy frameworks. And this is why you would find these decisions go with agriculture, with the environmental action plans and the responses to climate change that actually countries are implementing. But also, and I want to emphasize here, we just had the decision on the continental, the Africa CFTA, Continental Free Trade Area. And that in itself is actually engaging actually in the last year or so extensively in terms of what does the transnational, transregional trade and markets mean for agriculture, mean for food security, mean for the environment. And those are actually instruments that exist that are about catalyzing and incentivizing the scaling up of conservation agriculture at all levels. Over.
Okay, we have one more question that's come in for Tassos before we wrap up. This is from E. Jesus. To Mr. Haniotis, if there are so many scientific studies alerting about the risk of intensive tillage for soil degradation, water pollution, and so on, why is the CAP still supporting such practices?
We're not supporting practices that pollute. I mean, the way the question is asked distorts a little bit the reality. You can have a practice, let's call it conventional agriculture. You can have a farmer which, by doing conventional agriculture, does not violate existing legislation and respects the environment. What we try to do is identify, both at the regional and at the national level, these particular cases where these farmers, because sometimes of very bad management, end up doing a lot of damage. But we also try to do something else. We try to move away from practices that in the past, on the basis of the then science, were considered to be fine. But we have seen over the years that they are doing damage. we should not consider science as the delivery of the absolute truth. And it generates knowledge on the basis of the available information. We should not forget that all of the problems that we're identifying today all come from the fact that 50 years ago or 60 years ago, the challenges that the world faced were challenges that were mainly economic and social. And that's the path that we followed. And we have reached a level that we've seen that this happened at the cost of the environment. And now we need to find ways of bringing together, jointly delivering private and public goods. There are practices that could do that in a much better way than today, but these are not exclusive. And I think the important element of conservation agriculture and more benign, more environmentally friendly practices is to realize that now that the pressure is going to be on the conventional agriculture to do things better than what they have done, the advantage of conservation agriculture becomes more important because it has generated over the years a knowledge that is extremely important for other practices to assimilate. But I think it would be too simplistic to consider that we do support practices that damage the environment. This is not the case in such a black and white approach. By the way, if we had done that, we wouldn't have the result that the European agriculture is the only major agriculture in the world that has reduced emissions over the last 30 years. Not as much as we would like to do, but at least that indicates something.
For sure. Thank you, Tassos, very much. And thank you to all of the panelists for some great interventions. That's all the time we have for this panel. We're going to now head to a coffee break, and we'll be back here at 4:45 CET for our civil society panel, the last panel of the day. So take a quick coffee break, and we'll be back here with members of civil society.